board, the Labour lead over the Conservatives, 29, but you see we're counting in Labour areas. Tomorrow the rural areas come in. It'll make a great difference to the Conservative strength. And the computer prediction, which I suspect is still on the high side, that's my own guess, is still for a 40 lead of Conservative over Labour.
And now to Robin Day.
Well, of course, amid the welter of names and figures and percentages and predictions, this, of course, is not a game to see whether the polls are right or the computer is right. It's a question of a new government for the country and the impact its policies will have on the people of this country. And with me are two men who will be vitally affected by the policies of a government under Mr. Heath. Because with a majority of 40 or so, he's going to be able to push through the laws to deal with trade unions, which he's been campaigning about. And with me is Clive Jenkins, General Secretary of the Association of Scientific and Managerial Staffs, and Mr. Frank Chappell of the Electricians and Plumbers Union. Forgive me for not giving the full title. Now, gentlemen, as trade unionists, are you going to cooperate as law-abiding citizens in a law which Mr. Heath may pass, controlling your activities in some way or other? Mr. Jenkins.
There's obviously been a lot more Tory propaganda which has been lurid as opposed to the text of what they suggest. My own guess is that the Conservatives realise this is a trade union country and the white-collar revolution is going to roll along merrily, and they will take no steps whatsoever to halt or impede this progress.
But if they do?
I'm sure they won't.
But if they decide to bring in legislation, which the Labour government tried to do, but of a slightly different kind, are you going to cooperate or take industrial action against it?
Well, I think the answer must be, if it is in the interests of our members, fine. If it is opposed to our interests, I, for one, will be as irredentist and vigorous in dealing with it as I was in disliking what the Labour Party suggested.
Mr. Chappell.
I'm not so sure what Mr. Heath's proposals actually amount to as against what the Conservatives have been saying they would do to the trade unions if they gained power. I surmise their proposals are not as bad as the things they've been saying. My advice to any government in this country would be that they cannot govern this country without the full cooperation of the trade unions.
That, of course, is that I'm sure Mr. Heath would be the first to agree with that. On the other hand, he would also say that if he gets a mandate, a clear mandate, to pass laws for what he thinks is the better regulation of industrial relations, will you, as a trade union leader, cooperate in obeying those laws?
I don't think he can get such a mandate from the people of this country with a majority of 40, or indeed only half the people of the country ever likely to support a Conservative party in the House of Commons.
Well, this is a trade union leader giving a very novel doctrine of what a mandate is. A mandate is the authority given to the government which is appointed by the Queen after a general election, isn't it?
I should have thought a mandate was a mandate to do those things which you are capable of seeing through to their fruition, capable of producing the sort of results you want, which is industrial peace, productivity and a higher standard of living for the people of Britain. And if it doesn't do those things, I think you will have failed as a government.
One last question to you both. Leaving aside the details of Mr. Heath's plans, whatever they may be, do you think that a Conservative government is going to result in more industrial unrest, or I should say even more industrial unrest than we have seen under the Labour government? Mr. Jenkins?
Well, when I talked to Mr. Heath last, he said that the Conservative Party were interested in strong trade unions, in their participation in management, and in the extension of trade unionism right through the white-collar groups. I accepted his word, and I expect to see just that.
Are you satisfied any of your members here are getting enough overtime tonight, Mr. Jenkins?
If I was looking after them, I'm sure they'd do better than they are now.
Oh, mustn't go into that anymore. Mr. Taylor, of the Opinion Research Centre, I wanted to talk to the true trade union leaders first. We're going to an outside broadcast declaration at Hamilton, Mrs. Hamilton's, Mrs. Winnie Ewing's seat.
Is Aberdeen South. It's not Hamilton, this is Aberdeen South.
if I can just give you the vote, 23,843. And I declare that Ian MacDonald-Sproat has been duly elected to serve in Parliament for the constituency of Aberdeen South. Congratulations.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for that applause. I would just like to thank very briefly the returning officer and his colleagues for the excellent and efficient way in which they have conducted this count. I would also like to thank my opponents, Mr. Cockey, Mr. MacLeod, and Mr. Dewar, for the hard but very fair way.
Let's get it clear. That's Ian Sproat, the Conservative.
Yes, I'm sorry, I misinterpreted that at first sight. We got the figures all muddled. But this is the first Conservative gain in Scotland and surely must put paid to any hope of Labour achievements in that particular direction. If I could, there are two or three really very important things that seem to me to have happened in the last few minutes. Watford, which we heard about, 2 recounts, Labour have held. Labour have held on very surprisingly in Lewisham North, and they've held on in Portsmouth West against Brigadier Clark's attempt to get back. But in London, the biggest swing we've had tonight was in Clapham against David Pitt, the West Indian candidate in Clapham.
And now I think the result, the declaration is almost due in Hamilton. Here we go, let's go to Hamilton. Scotland must have Home Rule. Ewing, Ewing, Ewing. And this really is the seat of Mrs. Winifred Ewing, who won it in a by-election. How far are we off?
Well, the result should be announced in 2 or 3 minutes from now, but it's very much in doubt as to whether, in fact, Mrs. Ewing will be able to hold her seat. Outside the counting hall here in Hamilton, it's about the last 2 or 3 hours, there's been somewhere in about 300 or 400 SNP supporters all chanting for Mrs. Ewing, "We want Winnie." But inside here, the count has finished, and in a couple of minutes from now, the results should, in fact, be announced. The candidates are all lined up and they're ready to go up onto the platform. There's been a particularly heavy poll here, somewhere around about 79%, and that's somewhere in the region of 48,000 votes out of 60. The Labour candidate here is Mr. Alex Wilson. He was the man who lost the seat in the by-election in 1967 to Mrs. Winifred Ewing, the only SNP MP in the last Parliament. Mr. Wilson saw a Labour majority at that time of 16,500 votes totally disappeared before his eyes, and Mrs. Ewing was returned in the by-election in 1967 with a majority of 1,799 votes. Well, that's the situation at Hamilton at the moment. As I say, the results should be expected any minute now. There are still conversations going on. In fact, the Sheriff Dixon, the returning officer, has just now gone up onto the platform. With him is Mrs. Ewing. Also, there are the other candidates. Outside, as I say, the crowds are waiting to find out what the situation will be. The result will be announced in the hall, first of all. There will be a public announcement outside. There's been a particularly heavy poll, and the result is just coming up now.
I can see a declaration going on. If I'm not mistaken, it's George Thomas's seat.
That's right, George Thomas, the result actually being announced.
George Thomas.
Labour.
21,000. Look, I couldn't finish that. 21,655. Stephen Robert Charles Wanhill.
Liberal.
1594. Robert Coleman Williams.
Conservative.
15,878. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected. Oh, keep quiet. Keep quiet, for goodness sake. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency, Thomas George Thomas George Thomas. The number of ballot papers rejected and not counted by me at this election was 70. Signed, T. Miller.
So that's Cardiff
something like
West.
a 3% swing, 3 to 4% swing to the Conservatives, but George Thomas, the present Secretary for Wales, holds on to his seat. Actually, a slightly bigger swing there, I think, than Cardiff North, but that was the seat, the one seat in Wales that has changed hands.
We must hear now whether Winifred Ewing's got in or not. Because
Well, you can't hear. You will in a minute. Word about George Thomas.
Yes, indeed, because George Thomas has been the hammer of the nationalists in Wales. And what's interesting now is that this comes immediately before the Winifred Ewing result, because Willie Ross in Scotland has duplicated the position of George Thomas in Wales. Total resistance to any kind of devolution, any kind of concession to the nationalists, despite a lot of pressure in the Labour Party for concessions both to the Welsh nationalists and to the Scottish nationalists. As far as Winifred Ewing is concerned, remember that in '67 she wiped out a 16,500 result.
Up by 9,000.
Up by 9,000.
We've now out by 9,000.
Out by 9,000.
Let's go now. Let us go now and hear the declaration at Hamilton.
Sorry.
Now, if you will let me do it instead of...
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the result of the voting in the Hamilton constituency of Lanarkshire. The number of ballot papers rejected and not counted by me was 68, and the number of votes polled for each candidate was Winifred Margaret Ewing, 16,849, John Ross Harper, 5,455, Harry Charles Taylor, 295, Alexander Wilson, 25,431. And I declare Alexander Wilson has been duly elected to serve in Parliament as the member for the Hamilton constituency of Lanarkshire.
And there we have Mrs. Ewing out by a large margin, a massive swing back to Labour. We've had a flash that the Welsh nationalists have lost their seat in Carmarthen, so with the nationalists out of the House, all small parties seem to be suffering in this election, except for Mr. S.O. Davis in a party of one who has got back in Merthyr. But the nationalists have done very badly everywhere, except, I believe, and we've been flashing past these results, in Merioneth and in Anglesey, where they pushed up to second place and got 30% of the poll. But that will be small comfort to Plaid Cymru after losing Carmarthen, and small comfort to the Scottish nationalists who saved their deposit and got second place in Hamilton. They've only saved one other deposit so far on tonight's result in Glasgow Springburn.
Well, we had two results crashing there, and eventually we got Hamilton, Lanarkshire right and Cardiff West right. And now, for a comment on Mrs. Ewing out, let's go to Hugh Cochrane. Hugh.
Well, Labour was certainly thirsting with a vengeance for this one, and Alec Wilson personally, because he's the man who crashed so sorely to defeat at the by-election in 1967, and Labour have certainly achieved a turnout here. They got 25,000 voters out, which is roughly about the same as they were doing in their heyday in this constituency. A big disappointment for Mrs. Ewing, a big disappointment for the party. Mild correction to David Butler. SNP have saved their deposit in 2 or 3 places, but generally speaking, they have been dropping deposits all over the place in a most un-Scottish fashion. Cliff.
I've got a bit of sandwich in my mouth. Lichfield and Tamworth, I see. We're likely to have 2 brothers back here. This is a Major General back in, David Orr Goldsmith. Alan.
Yes, indeed. His opponent in the election said, what's the use of voting for a man whose name you can't even pronounce? But we pronounce it all right, so I no doubt the constituents will too.
But this is Terry Pitt, the Research Secretary of the Labour Party, defeated in a seat that has been Labour since 45.
The people who've had the biggest bashing around tonight, without doubt, are the pollsters, one way and another, and the predictors. Robin, you wanted to take this up just now. Now you may.
You've got the sheet again, the worksheet. Yes, here we've got Mr. Humphrey Taylor of the Opinion Research Centre, who does for the Evening Standard and the Sunday Times. Now, you heard what the Prime Minister was saying about the polls, but I want to put this to you, that whatever the Prime Minister says, the polls were one of the factors, surely, in his